From ancient civilizations to the lost city of Z, we've got you covered at Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels, demons, and monsters and serpents, to Brothers of the Serpent podcast, coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 candy cube of science, nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed, high atop the Edwards Plateau. I think we have a good show. We are going to try to sort of give a broad brush overview of everything.
Oh, God.
So yeah, that's in the plan. Basically, we had some requests to sort of to sort of help lead people to the rabbit hole and maybe down the first few turns so that from then on they're too lost to get back out, I think is the idea. So we're going to try to do that. It's kind of hard to do with this topic. So I think what we're going to shoot for is sort of give our personal journeys into the rabbit hole and then go from there. Maybe ask some classic questions that people would, that haven't looked into this kind of stuff would ask, and then attempt to answer them. We've had plenty of conversations with people about this kind of thing, so we probably should be able to do that. But first, before we get into all that, I should introduce our good friend and longhead from deep beneath his space station, far out in outer space, somehow on the opposite side of the planet, the antipode of the tangent cube in his 3x3x3 cylinder of space, Mr. Brett England, the Watcher. How you doing, buddy? What's going on?
How's it going, fellas? Now, I'm really excited to see how this goes, because the question itself is like, so what out there is like mysterious? All of it?
Yeah.
What's wrong with the standard model?
All of it? Yeah. Yep, it's gonna be a challenge, but challenge accepted. Right? Okay, as always, we have space weather news. Chance of storms. NOAA forecasters say there is a 60% chance of G1 class geomagnetic storms on January 24th when a stream of solar wind is expected to hit the Earth's magnetic field. The gaseous material is flowing approximately 600 kilometers per second from a hole in the sun's atmosphere. Arctic auroras are likely this Thursday. Also, a meteoroid hits the moon during lunar eclipse. On January 21st at 4:41:43 UT, a meteoroid slammed into the moon. We know because many amateur astronomers witnessed or photographed the explosion. A guy whose name I can't pronounce was one of them. He captured the fireball from Boa Vista, one of the islands of Cape Verde. As I was sorting through my pictures of the eclipse, I was trying to avoid images with dusty specks or hot pixels, says this guy with this name. Upon closer inspection, I realized that it was no hot pixel, it was a flash of light on the moon, and other astronomers had photographed it as well. So, at least a dozen reliable still images and videos of the impact have surfaced so far. Analyzing a sharp image taken by Christian Froschlin of the Netherlands, geologist and amateur astronomer, Justin Cowart has estimated the selenographic coordinates of the impact site, and the coordinates are given here. This puts it just to the west of the lunar crater Lagrange H. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter may be able to use such coordinates to target its cameras and photograph this brand new crater. Meteoroids hit the moon all the time. Literally, NASA has been observing the impact flashes since 2005. Recently, other groups in Europe have joined the hunt. Flashes are typically observed once every 2 or 3 hours of observing time. Impactors range in size from softballs to boulders, liberating energies equal to tons of TNT when they strike. The rare thing about this strike is that it was photographed during a full moon when lunar glare usually overwhelms the glow of any fireball. During the eclipse, however, Earth's shadow turned lunar day into almost night for an hour, allowing the fireball to be seen.
That's freaking
really
awesome.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, the eclipse was it was freaking cool. Like, I didn't stay outside the whole time to watch it, but
yeah.
I watched it for a little bit when it first started, and then I would come back and periodically check on it. And then I come out there and bam, all the stars were out and it was freaking dark. I was just like,
Yeah. And then the moon was like going through this amazing hue shift that was
Yeah.
just fantastic.
It was
Pinks
awesome.
and purples and oranges and reds. It's just, God, it was beautiful.
Yeah. Cool. But when it was first starting, I was like, oh my God, that looks like, it's got some kind of like goatee infection like growing up its chin. I'm just like, I was trying to imagine like, what ancient peoples that have, no idea. Like now it's like, oh, well, the Earth's shadow and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But if you didn't know any of that and you
Yeah.
were watching this, now granted it happens twice a year. So if you live outside, you'd see it twice a year pretty much.
Yeah,
Maybe.
twice a year something eats the moon.
Right. It would just be weird. Like the way it first starts, it's like creepy,
Yeah. Yeah. I think solar eclipses are probably far more terrifying because like everything's actually dark, right? And that's really scary.
Yeah.
I can imagine. And then of course the sky turns insanely weird looking during the full eclipse. But even if you just see it pass over part of it, you're like, oh my God! Oh my God! Right? Because you're like terrified that the sun is going out. And you know that everything's gonna die.
And that one's definitely going to be more freaky because it doesn't happen very frequently,
Right. Yeah. It's pretty rare.
Right.
And they're also very quick. Like if you took a nap, you'd sleep right through it. I mean, you might not even know.
Or if you were in the deep forest, it would just get dark. And
you're just like, why? Or it's cloudy. You just have no idea. Yeah. It would just suddenly get pitch black and you think the storm is going to be bad. It's just regular clouds. And the sun. So yeah, that's...
Super blood wolf moon with golf balls. Basic space weather news.
See, we're working on our ability to sort of like shrink things down into the basics here. Super blood wolf moon with golf balls.
Space weather news.
Okay, stand down or die.
So, remains of ancient life found beneath Antarctic ice.
Oh yeah.
Researchers say they have discovered the... sorry, I always forget to do this. This is www.ctvnews.ca. So researchers say they have discovered remains of ancient life undisturbed for thousands of years buried below the ice of an ancient Arctic lake. According to a press release by scientific journal Nature, the Subglacial Antarctic Lakes Scientific Access (SALSA) mission discovered the remains. The SALSA mission discovered the remains of the creatures in Antarctic subglacial Lake Mercer, a lake covered by 1,067 meter thick sheet of ice, which is 3,500 feet of ice.
Yeah.
I just did that calculation in my brain after I did it on my phone. SALSA scientists used a high-pressure hot water drill to cut a small channel through the ice to the lake, which had lain undisturbed for thousands of years, until now only seen through ice-penetrating radar. While cleaning lake mud...
There we are with the IPR again.
Yeah. While cleaning lake mud off of a temperature-measuring instrument pulled from the water, scientists discovered fragmented remains of creatures that had lived in the lake thousands of years ago. Though researchers say they were not expecting to find anything more complex than single-cell microbes, in the mud they found the remains of tiny crustaceans, tiny invertebrates called tardigrades, as well as specimens that likely come from plants or fungus. They theorized that the creatures likely inhabited ponds and streams in the nearby Transarctic Mountains, which pass 50 kilometers south of the Lake Mercer, and may have washed into the lake during brief warm periods when the glaciers receded. Figuring out when and where the creatures lived and the type of environments they needed to survive would increase our understanding of how Antarctic's glaciers moved, receded, and grew in cycles between ice ages, scientists say. The team now plans to carbon date the remains to try to determine more precisely how long ago they lived, as well as attempting to sequence their DNA. 12,000 years ago! That's gonna be freaking awesome, right?
Yeah. The Watcher says tardigrades, also known as the water bear, are microscopic animals which can survive in many extreme conditions, including space. Related. Speaking of science, the invincible tardigrade, already a weird animal, is full of DNA stolen from bacteria. So this is the one I was telling you about that I've watched videos of this guy. Right, of these little things.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And how they move around.
Yeah, they have the little picture of him here. He's like the little fat...
Yeah,
like
little
the,
fat like a
caterpillar-looking thing. Yeah.
But he's got little arms.
Yeah, they're funny.
Yeah, but if you watch videos of them like doing stuff, you can. It's so strange how you can relate to even something like that. Like you can see him struggling with shit, and he's like, "God dang it, get this thing over here!" And then he loses it. He's like, "No, come back!" Right? It's like you can totally identify with it, just even though it's like a single-celled little. Yeah, it's badass. I love watching videos of those guys trying to like do stuff in their little microscopic world, and I'm like, I totally recognize the problems he's having.
Yeah. Tardigrades.
This thing won't do what I want it to do.
They're always late.
They're always late.
They're really fat, and they can't move very fast.
They look like a six-legged, like no-headed version of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
They have little
Take
pillow
care.
heads.
Yeah. All right, is that it for the news?
That's all the news I got, man.
All right. Well, I was gonna say that was a spicy news story.
Yeah.
All right. So on to the main topic here, which is everything.
Oh God, here we go.
Well, not quite everything. We discuss a wide range of topics on this podcast, but by far the most discussed topic is
Pyramids.
yes,
Yes.
those ancient like alternative history, I guess you would call it. Like I've seen people list us as alternate history in podcast lists or whatever. So yeah, we discuss many other things, other mysteries, but mostly we're fascinated with mysterious stuff. And some of the mysteries we look at are modern. Some of them are fairly recent, not modern, but recent within the past few centuries. But we also spend a lot of time on the topic of ancient civilizations and basically the human story previous to the past 2,000 years, basically, right?
Yeah.
In the BC period and previous, or wait, BC just goes on forever, right?
Yeah.
I got that. There's no previous to BC.
I cannot
So-
do that.
Somebody asked us, like, can we kind of give an overview of the topic? And that's not really possible to do. I mean, like, yes, the overview is
We have
listen
been
to
doing
every
that.
podcast we've ever made.
That's what we've been trying to do.
That's right.
But it's similar to, it would be similar to the first episode that no one's ever heard because we started with episode 2.
Right. I've actually had people on Twitter asking, like, I want to hear episode 1. I'm like, does not exist.
But it's like, what do you tell somebody if, like in our minds, we're sitting down to do the first episode of the podcast, and it's like, we want to tell the non-existent but future audience everything.
Right. Yeah. It's hard.
It's really hard.
Not possible to do.
So we're gonna do it from our personal perspectives, our personal journeys
Yeah.
into these various mysteries, and that I think that's the best way to do it.
Yes. Yeah. So for me, I've always loved mysteries. I've always been a big fan of reading. Right. I was always had my nose in a book. Fiction. I love to read fiction. I have an enormous library of fiction, science, and horror. Anything that had mysterious stuff in it that the characters were dealing with. Like, I loved it, right? I would read the books for the mysteries in them. Like, that's what I loved. It's like, if I got science fiction, the stuff that I loved was because the characters were encountering some kind of mystery that they had to solve in some way or another. So once I found out that there were actual real mysteries all over the world, I was just like, oh my crap, holy crap, like, give me more. And I spent thousands of hours researching all these mysteries. And so once you start to look into the details of all these archaeological sites or these ancient mythologies and then the connections between them, and then so you get two things when you look at this. You get one part you get, obviously, is the standard model story, what we call the standard model story, which is the accepted archaeological explanation for various cultures, sites, so on and so forth. You get that. But if you kind of go past that and say, what are the things that they didn't understand about these things, right? I read this thing and the guy's like, okay, so this site, here's what we found, and here's what we know, and here's what we think we know, and here's the story that we're putting together. Then you say, all right, but there are things that don't make sense, and almost like a lot of honest scientists will say this, like this part is not clear, or how they did this is not fully understood, or the reason for this thing is not completely understood. You know, like it's like when you go into a museum, the stuff that they put on display, they have explanations for on the plaque, and they'll just tell you this is a ceremonial object, right? Or this is some kind of tool, or this is that, or this is. But so basically, it's rare for museums to put objects on display that they have no explanation for, because what are they going to write on their plaque, you know? So they will call them ceremonial, and then people will just accept that explanation. So when you start to dig into the mystery behind these things, like what does this mean? You know, how is this really explained? And then you find out that no one really has explanations for this stuff. That fascinated me, and so that led me down the rabbit hole initially, was my love of mysteries in the first place. So I have more to go in that direction, but let's let you do your part first too. Like, how did you first sort of got into this?
So I've always been into finding ancient artifacts, so namely arrowheads.
Yeah, he's a big looter.
Yeah. Used to walk around the property that I grew up on in Georgia, and find these beautiful artifacts. And I was just at that young age, I wasn't blown away by this mysterious find. It was just cool to find this little treasure. That's kind of the way it was exciting in that way.
Right.
And then as I got older and started to realize, like, well, these things are really ancient, and they were left behind by people and created, then it became more and more fascinating to go explore the land and see like where the sites were, and imagine that these people lived here, and what was their story, and how did this tool leave their hands and come to be here. So
take care.
It was always like sort of like the Indiana Jones thing, like seeking out this buried treasure or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It was always like my thing. I love the idea of finding buried treasure. And so sites like the Great Pyramid, these big famous monuments that were left behind, those were cool to me too, but the story had been told. I'd always heard, oh, well, there were tombs, and
there was no treasure in them.
There was all the story about how they were built and who built them and why. And so it didn't really hold this incredible mystery in my mind, because I had always just learned the stories and known and assumed that that's what we knew, and that was true. And I remember one time we were looking at the pictures of the pyramid and the structure on the interior, and I was like, yeah, well, they were just tombs, and you were like, well, they never found anybody inside these. Like when they first broke them open, like the first guy to break in there didn't find anybody, and I was like, what? I was like, yeah, none of the Great Pyramids didn't find anybody.
Yeah.
And I was just like, what? And so I what? Right. So there's a lot of arguments that people have, like, oh, well, they were looted in antiquity and blah, blah, blah. But the more you dig into it, if you really, I was curious, so I dug into it more and more, and it just there doesn't seem to be any way that anybody could have looted and left it. Like, whoever looted it, if it was looted, were possibly the builders of it. So why would they do it?
Yeah.
Because they'd put it back together in ways that, the more modern people that finally blasted in there with picks and dynamite and whatever. So it's like, I start to think about what are the possibilities.
There are weird tunnels cut through the rock in the Great Pyramid, but
they don't go anywhere.
They don't go anywhere to the outside, and they're completely locked inside the pyramid. So yes, very strange.
So suddenly, these sites that I had always known, that everybody knew the answers for what they were, became mysteries. And then I just started diving into that. And then the fact that there are all these other anomalous, massive stone construction sites all over the world that nobody really knows who built them or why. And it's just, the more you look, the more there is.
Right.
And it just seems like never ending. And it started to really wipe the slate clean in my mind of all of the all of the stories we've been telling ourselves about who we are and where, how the development happened, I can no longer sign on to that story, and therefore all of it becomes a fantastic mystery. And so that's kind of, plus I was, raised Christian, and we had studied the Bible, which is, a book full of ancient texts written by various different people throughout the ages. And those are very mysterious.
Yeah.
And as I started to look into other ancient texts, outside the canon,
Yeah.
I was just blown away by some of the things that are said in these ancient texts, and how they correlate to these other stories that start to sort of make more sense out of the canon of the Bible. And going back to, the Egyptian mythology and how that connects, and all these ancient texts that I just dove into, and like I had talked to you all about that site, sacred-texts.com.
Yeah.
I just would go through there and just read all these different things, and they're all seemingly connected to me, and that's a huge mystery. It's like, where did all this knowledge come from? Like, how, we've been passing it down. It's just so never-ending rabbit hole there. So that's how it really.
Yeah, comparative mythology was a big one for me too. When I had gotten my fill, when I basically gone online and was like, okay, show me every mysterious ancient site, show me every mysterious ancient culture, show me every mysterious ancient place, show me every mysterious ancient artifact, right? And I had done all the reading about all that stuff. Then, of course, going through all that reading also leads you into seeing the mythology in some cases or in some places from various cultures. And I started to see similarities across cultures and across thousands of years, if you're going by the standard model, from when these cultures existed or when this particular artifact or story was told. So you're like, okay, wait a minute. These people on the other side of the planet are telling a very similar story, or a story that has a whole lot of elements that are the same as this story from this way
entire
over here.
other continent across an ocean.
Yeah, it's thousands
Of a different
years.
time period.
Yeah, totally different time period, and some seemingly completely disconnected. So that led me into comparative mythology, where I started to look at all of these. I went through the major myths, and you have the Ennead, which are the 9 gods of Egypt, and that's a. First of all, anything you say about Egypt is. You can't say that this is Egypt had this or Egypt had that, because Egypt lasted for freaking 2,000 years at minimum, probably more like 4 or 5 or 6,000 years. Like that culture that we call ancient Egypt is incredibly long, So if you think of Western civilization, both old world and new,
the beginning of that culture was ancient to the end of it.
right?
In other words.
Yeah. That's right.
It's just.
But it's also like the whole thing, that Cleopatra, who was a Hellenistic Egyptian ruler, is closer to us in time than she was to the Great Pyramids.
Yeah, according to the standard dating of
right. If you take just the standard dating of the pyramids, that they were basically 4,000 BC or so, the Great Pyramids on the plateau. She is closer to us than she is to the building of the pyramids. That is a huge span of time, right? And she was a ruler at basically the end of what we think of as being Egypt, the dynasty period. So you can't just be like, so Egypt was this, because that's impossible to say about something that lasted for 4,000 years. It went through drastic changes all through it. So, but basically the Ennead is the 9 gods of Egypt, and then you have the 9 gods of Olympus, right? And then you have the Nordic pantheon, the whole Odin and all those guys. And you have the Chinese gods and various spirits and dragons and everything like that. All the different Asian cultures and their gods and stuff. Like Japan has hundreds of what they call uni, god spirits, or it doesn't really translate properly. But once you start to see all these things and you start to recognize that there are these similar stories couched within these different cultures, and that takes a while to see in some cases, because there's a lot of detail. Like in India, India is also a very, very ancient culture. And it has thousands of deities. There are like very few big main ones, like the top ones, Indra, Rama, those guys or whatever. But there's just thousands of characters. But you start to recognize similarities, like the Sumerian deities, the Egyptian deities, the ancient Greek deities, the Roman ones. Like everyone knows that the Greek and Roman gods are basically the same. Jupiter is Zeus, and right, you go back and forth with those. So it's that same thing, even though those cultures directly overlapped both physically and in time. When you recognize that the same thing seems to be happening mythologically with all these stories across the world, you're like, wait a minute, okay, I understand how mythologically Rome and Greece overlap, because Rome just conquered Greece and then they sort of like appropriated everything, right? But how does that overlap with Chinese stuff?
Yeah.
Or overlap with like the Sumerian stuff, you know? Well, they're like, well, the story is that the Sumerian stuff went to the Egyptians, and then the Greeks took over Egypt, and the Romans took over Greek, the Greeks, and right? So you can stack all those Mediterranean stuff on top of each other, but it starts to get harder to explain when you start to see these things around the world. And yes, like the Watcher's pointing out, the stuff in South America, Central America, and Mexico, and possibly North America as well.
Yeah, the Olmecs, the Incans, the Mayans.
So the next thing you have to look at is pyramids. Okay, we talk about this all the time on the podcast. We have all these jokes about giant triangles around the world. Why was everybody building pyramids? Because
they were the easiest structures to build.
Right. I mean, when you want to just stack rocks up on top of each other and they're going to last forever. Right. But everybody around the world for a certain period of time, it doesn't matter what time, but at some point in time, all over the world, pyramids were built. Right. Now, the standard model spreads them out and like divides them by New World and Old, and then says that, and then tries to put them in some sort of chronological order, like the small, crappy ones to the big, great ones. But even their own story doesn't tell that story. The Great Pyramid, or basically the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, which include the Great Pyramid, the two other ones that are there, are some of the oldest in Egypt. You can't say that those were, even though they are the pinnacle in terms of like awesomeness, they are also some of the first built. Yeah. So that right there, if you're inclined to study mysteries, that right there should give you a clue as to the idea here that we're looking at, that like something other than the story that has been built that we've been told is going on. Like the best pyramids are also the oldest.
Yeah.
They happen almost at the very beginning of Egypt's history that lasts for 4,000 years or whatever. It was, according to the standard model, built in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, which puts them at the very beginning. The Old Kingdom is the beginning of ancient Egypt, and the 4th dynasty was like a few hundred years into its, So anything before that they call pre-dynastic. And according to the standard model, pre-dynastic Egypt was basically, sort of advanced butt flap guys, right? And then all of a sudden, bam, they're building giant triangles all over the place and huge temples, and they have a complete pharaonic culture, and the hieroglyphs just show up out of nowhere. They completely, fully realized with, and they're cutting gigantic stones and dragging them halfway across the world, and you're just like, all right, what's really going on here?
Yeah.
And that in the end is the question that we ask all the time on this podcast. What is really going on? That's really the question. And what's interesting is if you start to dig into the archaeological papers, rather than reading popular news stories. Okay, popular news stories are trying to tell you like something awesome was just discovered or whatever, and then they're going to give you a quick, brief, standard model explanation.
Right.
Okay. They're not going to, just the way popular news stories go, for some reason, they don't ever, unless they're telling you, like, scientists were baffled by this thing, but they're about to understand it. That's usually how they explain it, right? Or scientists were baffled by this and it was completely unexpected, but they're able to explain it completely right now. That's usually the way those stories go. But if you sort of dig it, if you look at the papers themselves, or even some of the quotes from the scientists, they'll be like, well, this completely surprised us, or this was unexpected, or... and once you start to see that enough, you're like, okay, everything is unexpected. In certain places. Astronomy, this happens a lot. Things that were completely unexpected that they find. And in archaeology, it happens a lot. So you're looking at this stuff and this is totally unexpected, or things keep getting older. They keep finding things that are older, right?
Yeah.
And so something like, I remember before a site called Göbekli Tepe, which regular listeners of the podcast will know about, but for anyone who's new, Göbekli Tepe is, as of now, one of the oldest known monumental sites in the planet, on the world, that's been found so far, right? It's placed right at the end of the last ice age, which makes it about between 12 and 10,000 years old.
Yeah, the next one is 6,000 years after that.
Right. So before Göbekli Tepe was widely known about, like they've been digging on it since the 90s, but before it was sort of published and widely known about, you would have been ridiculed for suggesting that there was anything like that anywhere in the world, and people regularly were. I frequented forums that talked about mysteries. And on the archaeology sections of these forums, there were always people in there who were skeptics and quote unquote, and they were in there to tell you were full of shit if you're talking about an ancient civilization. And they would ridicule you if you talked about anything older than Sumer. Yeah. And then Göbekli Tepe is found, and like immediately everybody's trying to say, oh, we know this, we totally understand it, it's built by these people, and we know exactly what was going on. And you're like, no, you don't, and no, you don't, and no, you don't, and no, you don't. Right.
And they're completely isolated, by the way. They're just an anomaly.
Right.
Right.
It's just an anomaly. It just appears out of nowhere right at the end of the Ice Age, and then it just vanishes.
One small little butt flap culture just suddenly decided to cut huge blocks of stone and stand them up and carve them and whatever.
And like into an enormous site, which only like less than 1% has been uncovered.
Yeah.
And then they buried it all on purpose and made it, and it was such an enormous place that it actually made a man-made hill that for thousands of years afterwards, everybody just thought was a hill.
Potbelly.
And then they just disappeared, right? Sounds familiar. And the reason it sounds familiar is because that's all over the world, and we'll get into that after the break.
Relentless and unstoppable pursuit of ancient mysteries. Brothers of the Serpent podcast. So, this is what it's all about. The thing about the standard model is it will have you believe that there are not very many ancient mysteries. There are not very many mysteries in the things that we found. And it's, to their credit, they're trying to put a story together that's incredibly complex, and I'm talking about archaeology here.
I cannot do that.
So it's nice to have a story, but what I wish was more the case is that they would say, here's a possible story, and make that more understood by the public, that like this is just a possible story.
Yeah.
Right? We don't have all the answers, but that's just not the way it's delivered, and that may have a lot to do with journalism on the subjects.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of interests involved in telling the story, and that's another, when you realize that, and you can find that information just by, there's a lot of authors out there that talk about the controversial aspects of the stories that are being told about the ancient sites that have been found. And there's just a lot of it's like people get trashed if they go against the standard model.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of pushback against changing the story. And
I mean,
rewriting all
not
the
just
text.
trashed. You can lose your ability to get grants. You can be ostracized by your peers.
Yeah.
They'll think you're kooky if you're looking at alternative ideas that sort of upend the archaeological story that's been told.
Right.
So it is very, very, very difficult to buck the system. And this is, as in many other systems. It's just hard to go up against it, you know. Like one good example that I can just throw out there real quick is that sort of encompasses a lot of this of what we're talking about. For a long time, mythological stories, what we call mythological stories now, were considered to be true by everyone.
Yep.
Okay. It isn't until the advent of the sort of modern technological university-based, you know, sort of like
Learning centers.
yeah, well, quote unquote, scientific technological civilization, where people started to sort of just kind of trash all those things and sort of discount them as myths, you know, stories that are totally untrue that were made up by primitives. Okay, and I'm not just talking about like, you know, primitive tribes in various places that don't have electricity. I'm talking about like even cultures that were considered to be extremely advanced, like the Greeks. All of their stuff was totally mythologized by modern civilization and considered to be complete fabrications, right? So the Odyssey and the Iliad that tell the story of the basically, you know, there's a lot of stuff in those stories, but the overall idea is the war with Troy. Okay, it was considered completely mythological.
Stand down,
Like,
die.
for a long time, that story was considered to be true history. Okay, there was a lot of interesting, strange stuff in it that we still think of as fictional now, but for a long time, that was a true story to people. And then you get into the modern technological age, and it was just totally like, oh, it never happened. There's all these gods and nymphs and freaking cyclopses and sirens, and it's just magic. It's crap, right? It's this giant myth. It's a fiction. Well, there was one guy who was sort of a maverick, you know, not accepted as an archaeologist at all, okay? But he decided that he thought that was a real story. And he went to the source and read it in detail and decided that he could figure out, based on the actual information given in the story, that he could figure out where Troy was. Okay, and everybody thought he was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Stupid. And this guy went out and found Troy.
Yep.
And I mean, dug through multiple layers of civilization in this one a place out there
Yes.
that was an ancient ruined place, and it was a known ancient site. You know, it had stacks and layers and layers and layers of ruined civilizations on it, but all the top layers were sort of primitive. He dug down and down and down until he found advanced stonework.
Yeah.
And it was like basically shown to be the basic layout of Troy that was given in the story. Okay, and then he found catacombs and all kinds of crazy stuff there. And eventually, after a long period of he's publishing and he's writing people letters and they're just ridiculing the hell out of him. And it's like, oh my God, he doesn't even know what he's doing and it's not Troy. But eventually it had to be accepted by the scientific community, by the archaeological community, that is actually Troy and that story was real.
Yeah.
That Troy existed and there was a giant war and it was obviously destroyed and burnt flat. Like, that's totally what happened according to the archaeological data that this guy found, right? So that sort of encompasses like the whole thing. Like that guy was able to buck the system by having patrons that allowed him to go out there and do the work he wanted to do, right? Having somebody that believed in him, but none of the archaeological community did. They were like, it's ridiculous, it's a myth.
Yeah.
You know? But even today, we've found Troy. And then we know that most of the other Greek civilizations that were talked about in that story were real. They found evidence of them and even their kings and all this stuff, and they found, you know. But still, the vast majority of that story is considered to be total fiction. Now think about that. You go read the Odyssey and the Iliad, and some of it you're like, holy shit, like what? Like one-eyed giants, you know, like sirens, you know?
Yeah, they can eat a whole person or
Right.
a couple of people.
But consider
In a day.
that there are large parts of that story that have been proven true, and yet we're still like, okay, but all the rest of it's still bullshit, right, guys? Right, guys? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Once you start to understand that there's this big resistance to the discovery of that kind of stuff, because like you can't even try to go find it and be legit, you know? While you're trying to find it, you're totally laughed at. And then when you actually find it, you're ridiculed, right? And you have to keep pushing it out and pushing out the information until eventually they will grudgingly sort of start to accept it, and then eventually everybody will pretend that they knew it all along, right? That's the way that it goes. So, back to what we were talking about before the break about this phenomenon happening all over the world of ancient civilizations just appearing seemingly out of nowhere, fully formed, and then degrading from there. Okay? Not every ancient civilization did this, but a lot of them did, or seem to have done, in other words. And Egypt is one of the biggest ones. A lot of the ones that are in South America seem to have done this too. That there was this, like in other words, when you look at the details of the archaeological sites, and I'm not going to name any, just all over the world this happens. When you look at the details of the archaeological sites, you find out that the most recent stuff there is the most primitive stuff. In terms of stonework, difficulty of construction, mysterious ways that they did it that we can't figure out, okay? The farther down you go in the layers...
Artistic quality.
Right, artistic quality, like quality of work, just difficulty in period, in all ways. Difficulty in like weights of movement, cutting the type of stone, how they transport it from here to the other place, how they stood them up. Like, as you go down in the layers of stonework, the deeper you get, the older it is, and the better it is, basically. The bigger the stones, the more difficult the work, the more beautiful and more exacting and more precise the artwork, until in some places, like in Egypt, there's precision on a level that's, in the most ancient stuff, there's a precision on a level that's just not even, that in some cases can't be mapped today. And now that's something that people are like, oh my God, like, of course we could do it today. Like, okay, so in some cases, or I should say, in most cases, we could probably reproduce some of the highest quality, most ancient stuff found in Egypt. But in some cases, we totally could not. At least not without inventing entire new disciplines and, you know, or building the site in such a way that it is impossible for it to look like it does, like they did it, in other words. Like, for example, Baalbek in Lebanon. We could not do what they were obviously doing there with the bottommost layer of stones without completely having a different looking site. In other words, by making a gigantic flat road going from the quarry to the site. We could not do it without that.
Yeah.
There is no way we could move the gigantic stones they were using from the quarry to the site without building an enormously flat road that does not exist. Right? Because when you build a road, you cut everything down, all the mountains and everything. You cut everything flat, right? If there's mountains in your way, you got to cut them flat. You got to get them out of your way. You build a huge tunnel or something, right? None of that's there, and yet they were clearly moving gigantic blocks from quarry to site, and there is no pathway between those two. So we might be able to cut those giant blocks, and we might be able to build something that can pick them up, and we might be able to build something that can both pick them up and move them over the site and then place them very precisely like they were, but not without cutting a gigantic flat roadway between the quarry and the site, and they didn't do that, so we could not do it like they did it.
Yeah.
So, Baalbek is a kind of a one-off, like, the stones at Baalbek are just absolutely enormous. Now, there might be places around the world that have similar, and there are some stones at, like deep down in the, what is it called? The,
Mount, Temple Mount?
The Temple Mount, the platform of the Temple Mount. And those platforms, the Temple Mount platform in Jerusalem is very similar in sort of style in certain ways, in the deepest parts at the very bottom, as the platform at Baalbek, okay? Those places are close enough together to figure that, like, whoever did those things were probably the same people. But if you look at the standard model, they do say that, but they give it to the Romans, and it's like, but there's no evidence that the Romans did any of that, right? So when you start to look in the details of it, which we're not going to go into now, but the details of that site, of both of those sites, are just like, okay, wait a minute, that story doesn't make sense. Okay. So, how is it that the very bottommost layers in places all over the world, South America, Central America, China, Egypt, you know, all throughout Northern Africa and like the Mediterranean and everything, the bottommost layers are the ones that are the most advanced in terms of difficulty.
The other really cool thing about these sites that you can find from time to time are in the ancient texts, and there's, you know, people might call them mythological or legends about the site itself that, giants built it, whatever.
Right.
That's interesting. But there are other types of connections that are beyond some
cannot
type
do
of, like, for example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which comes from Sumer, or from the culture of Sumer, I think the tablets that
Or Babylonian.
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
but
Which is
they got it from Sumer. Yeah.
Right. in that story, they talk about the area where the gods had built some stronghold, and there was this massive creature there that protected the land of the gods or whatever, Humbaba.
Yeah.
And he lived up in where the great cedars were,
Yeah.
and that's Lebanon.
Yeah.
And Baalbek is there.
Right.
So it's like you have this. By the way, the standard model attributes Baalbek to the Romans.
Yeah.
And there's a really good argument against the platform that the Temple of Jupiter is built on, that
Yeah.
it is not Roman. Right. So
In other words, the Temple of Jupiter is totally Roman.
right.
There's a lot of evidence for that. But the platform, the giant stone platform that it's built on, is not.
And that's
Yeah.
and that's Baalbek, and this is where these massive stones we're talking about.
Yeah.
So there's this 6,000-year-old culture that has
Way pre-Roman.
way
pre-Roman.
that has this legend where the guys in the story, whether it's a fictional story or not, are talking about these gods that live over here that have built all this crazy technology in this place in Lebanon where these cedars are.
Yeah.
And this is right near the site of Baalbek.
Yeah.
So it's just little connections like that that you find. And,
Yeah,
and
that's a good
with the-
point. That even if it's fictional, it doesn't matter. Like, if it's a fictional story, like every fictional story has lots of true stuff in it, right?
Right.
You can read mystery
Like
novels.
we watch movies all the time that take place in real places.
Yeah.
And the story is fictional. The characters are fictional characters, but they are in LA. They're in New York.
Right.
And those are real places. They go into buildings that really exist.
Yeah.
They have jobs that are real jobs.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
Positions of jobs that are actually held by real people that really do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a similar thing. But another one is the Temple Mount. That area is, in the legends is like, it's extremely sacred. They call it the navel of the world. This is where the gods first came down.
Yeah.
And there's these stories in the apocryphal texts about these guys who came down, and basically if you break away all of the religious context to the story, it's like a group of
Someone.
officials
Yeah.
break from their government, right? That's basically set all the rules for what everybody's going to do, and they come down there and they build a city there.
Yeah.
And they establish like a stronghold,
Yeah.
right? Now this is where the Temple Mount is, and you
Yeah.
go down there and there's these and it's the guys that are doing this, these officials have their characters have roots in greater antiquity.
Yep.
Leading back to Sumer once again. There's just so many of the characters are similar. Like the guy who's running everything, is a lower official back in Sumer. Like he's not the number one guy,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
it's so you can. It's like you go around the world and you look at these anomalous sites, and then you look at the texts that tell stories around them. They're almost talking about them. It's just.
Yeah, and then another thing that's very fascinating to me, like when you start looking into, and sometimes this is hard to find, but when you start looking into, like, I've got the standard model for this site, right? This anomalous megalithic site. What are the local legends? Right. What do the locals say about it, or what do they say the old stories are that they've heard from their grandfathers are? And what's fascinating is a lot of these sites that have anomalous megalithic stonework. The local legends talk about, number one, giants, but also, in many, many cases, something about sound, right? They'll say something like, these were whistled into place by two people overnight, right?
Yeah.
Or dwarves came out of the ground and sung them into place, right? They moved the stones through the air by singing, or there's ancient Tibetan myths about moving giant blocks of stone using musical instruments.
Yeah.
So there's
And then the Sumerian texts have a whole list of these powerful tools called the May.
Yeah.
And they're and among them are these musical instruments that have like these incredible powers and
Right.
stuff like that. You know, I don't know. It's just there's all kinds of weird connections like that.
Yeah.
And okay, so I guess finding one of those is interesting, but when you keep paying attention and keep digging deeper and deeper and keep looking, and you start to see more and more and more and more of these connections between the texts across the globe from different civilizations that were completely disconnected from each other by massive bodies of water, and that they're building the same types of structures, the same shapes, the same types of stonework. Like even in the details of the masonry, it looks the same. And then they have their stories, and the characters in their stories have names that are different, but they mean the same thing to the people who spoke those names.
Right.
You know, foam of the sea or came out of the sea.
Right.
All of these.
Poseidon.
And they're
Poseidon is the god of the ocean.
yeah, and they're in many cases talking. It's like later peoples are talking about the people who came and built this came from across the sea.
Yeah.
They floated here on a giant fish or something like that. And
Yep.
there's just all these similarities. And the story we're telling ourselves today in terms of the standard model is that it was isolationism. Like this culture was totally isolated and they just did all this stuff on their own. And then
Right.
this other culture was totally. It doesn't line up. And so that immediately increases the mystery.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, okay, maybe it's this exciting prospect that there was some previous civilization that had circumnavigated the globe that might possibly have influenced all of the building methods and the mythology in all of these different areas. That would be phenomenal.
Right. So here's a question that often gets asked by people who are just starting to look into this stuff, right? I know you're not saying it's aliens, but are you saying it's aliens? Right, and so that immediately, because everybody's heard of or seen parts of or pieces of Ancient Aliens, right? The thing I love about Ancient Aliens, and I still love it, I completely disagree that aliens came down and built anything, and they're not actually saying any of that. They're implying that aliens were influencing these ancient civilizations who were just primitive peoples, and then there was some sort of visitation or paleo contact.
One of the other names that was thrown about were ancient astronauts.
Yeah.
But they thought that was a little cheesier, and
Right.
ancient aliens might be more attractive as a
Right.
name. So it doesn't necessarily mean aliens. It could have been other cultures that lived on Earth that had the ability of flight.
Right.
That's one of the things that they suggest in the show.
Yeah. Right. So the idea of Ancient Aliens is, like, overall is to ask, was there some sort of advanced influence on these otherwise primitive cultures that resulted in all of these anomalous sites? Or even if they're not sites, in some cases Ancient Aliens will just dig into, like, how did they even have this math, right? Like with the Maya, they dig into, like, well, how did they get this calendar? Like, it's so freaking precise, and yet the rest of their culture does not show the same mathematical level of advancement. And the Mayans didn't seem to be circumnavigating the globe, but their calendar is so freaking precise that the only way you could really get that precise is if you were mathematically advanced and you were a globe navigator and were doing cartography and advanced in astronomy. So
Spherical trigonometry.
right. So eventually it was figured out. It was eventually figured out that the Mayans inherited their calendar technology and some of their astronomical understanding and knowledge from a much more ancient civilization that is very mysterious, that is very little is known about, called the Olmecs, that lived all throughout South America, all the way up into Central America and the lower parts of Mexico. Okay, that's known as the Olmec culture, and they're much, much older and far more ancient and far more mysterious than the Mayans. And it's clear because people have found quote-unquote Olmec sites, but they're known as Olmec because they're not anything else, right? So basically, a lot of the stuff in Central South America or whatever where they're looking at it and they're like, okay, this is this can't be attributed to any of these cultures because it's too old. It's just Olmec, right? This is the Olmec civilization. They found the same calendrical data in the Olmec civilization stuff as what the later Mayans had, right? And some of the other civilizations around there too. The Toltecs, so on and so forth. But, so you see that this, like, the Mayans are fairly recent. You know, they were still around when Europeans started showing up, okay? They weren't all gone yet. But, so what it starts to look like is that what we think of as the Mayan civilization is actually, like, parts of it are very advanced, and that's because it was a legacy of a previous civilization that itself may have been holding a legacy of an even earlier and far more advanced civilization that we still don't know anything about because their story is so scattered. And that leads us to, so you get all the way back to, like, you have the Sumerians, which are the accepted, right, the oldest civilization in the world or whatever, the oldest city building, urban civilization. Right. So they found some Central and South American places. I can't remember where they were specifically. Doesn't matter. The point is that there are pyramids down there basically that are just about as old as the Sumerian, 5,000 BC, right? Sumerians are supposed to be 6,000 BC or so, 6 to 4,000 BC. There are places down in there are sites in the Americas that have been found that are that old now. Okay. But then when you start talking about before that, well, there's one pyramid down there somewhere that's got a lava flow on top of it. Part of it's covered partially in lava, which has been geologically dated to like 8,000 BC. So nobody ever talks about it, right? That's impossible. But the point is that there's this long gap, and then you have Göbekli Tepe. And now some other sites may be emerging. Göbekli Tepe, by the way, is in Turkey, or it's right on the border of Turkey and something. I can't remember what the place is, but there is also a place in Indonesia called Gunung Padang that has been dated. The lower levels of it, like what basically they drilled down, they did a core, and they took dates and like the whole the whole hill, sort of like Göbekli Tepe, is constructed. It's artificially built, and the lowest levels they were giving them extremely ancient dates, like 25 to 30,000 years old. Yeah. Okay, so that may be older than Göbekli Tepe, but that still needs a lot more research. Göbekli Tepe is fairly well accepted, and the dates are pretty rock solid according to the standard model, and everybody has sort of grudgingly accepted, okay, this happened right at the end of the catastrophic period that ended the last ice age. Okay, so the last ice age was highly destructive at the end of it, and there were two destructive periods with a long destructive like period in between. Like there were two enormous destructive things that happened. One that like seemed to end the ice age, and then everything refroze real quickly, and then there was 1,000 years of like all kinds of volcanoes and earthquakes, and everything was horrible, and then there was another incredibly destructive event that ended the ice age for good. About 1,000 years later, you have Göbekli Tepe, or the end of it at least, right? Yeah. So the thing about these global cataclysmic events is that they're ELEs in other words, they're extinction level events. They wipe out all kinds of life all over the planet. The other thing is that they're so destructive, geologically speaking, that any advanced civilization that existed previous to that would have been almost completely erased. Like giant cataclysmic events totally erase entire giant areas of the globe and rewrite waterways, totally change climates, the ocean. Like there's even some talk about the anomalous period at the end of the Young Ice Age, like shut off all of the ocean cycles for that 1,000 years, and then they suddenly restarted at the end of it. Right, so you have these, and then you've got huge tidal waves rolling across the planet, earthquakes that are of a magnitude beyond anything we've ever experienced or can even imagine. There are frozen waves of Earth in some places on the Earth from earthquakes that were so enormous that the ground liquefied and waves were rolling across the hard ground, what is now hard ground. And there's places where you can see pictures of it is frozen, like there's a big swell that was obviously rolling across this flat plain, and it just froze there, right? Because it's a geologically speaking, if you have enough shaking going on and it lasts for long enough, it'll liquefy the surface. And then it can move like liquid. And so there were waves that were rolling across the surface, and then it eventually hardened and just got stuck there. So like earthquakes that you can't even imagine, gigantic tidal waves that are thousands of feet high.
Sea levels drastically rising or falling.
Yeah. So like at the end of the last ice age, the sea level rose 400 feet. Well, the humanity has always been coastal. Like the vast majority of us live on the coast, right?
Yep.
So
near water.
Yes.
Always.
Right. And also living on the coast is great. The beaches are awesome.
Yep.
And
so you find these anomalous megalithic stone structures way up in the high altitudes.
Right.
High elevations, I should say. That just like, where were they getting water? I mean,
yeah.
like, how can you live here? You can't.
Right.
You can't even grow anything here.
Right.
But there's signs of agriculture,
Yes.
etc. So.
Yeah. So the other thing that's interesting, all throughout South America. Okay. So wait.
Yes?
Before I get to that, let's talk about the triple A's. Right. The 3 A's of ancient civilizations: astronomy, architecture, and agriculture. Okay. These are the 3 main remnants. Components. Now there are a bunch of other ones. There's metallurgy, and there's I saw that there was like a list of 9, but the 3
Writing.
writing. But the 3 main ones that we have lots of evidence for all over the planet is the mostly what we have is architecture. Tons and tons of architecture all over the world. But in the architecture we see astronomy.
Yeah.
Now, this has only been fairly recently accepted, and that's and I'm talking about like within the last 10 years that it's been more and more widely accepted that, okay, these sites are almost all the time astronomically aligned in some way or another, okay? Like, that was just not accepted until very recently, in the past 2 decades. Previous to that, anyone who thought that was sort of a kook, according to the, to the mainstream
Whatever alignments
archaeology.
they found were just chance.
Right. And then sometimes the alignments are off, and so they were like, well, they're not really aligned, and so they weren't good at this. But it's becoming more and more clear that they knew what they were doing. They're so ancient, the sites are, that the alignment's off because of precession, which is a whole another subject. In other words, that there's a large astronomical cycle that causes alignments to slowly drift out of place.
For more on that, listen to episode 72.
Yes. And every other episode we've ever done. So the third one, though, and this is the one I want to talk about, is agriculture. And we will get to that after the break. Institute for Advanced Coprolite Studies. Some people are saying we're saying that wrong, so I'll say it like they want. Coprolites. Advanced Coprolite Studies, where there are no degrees, only certificates of ignorance. Because we don't know shit about what the hell is going on. Actually,
We don't know ancient shit.
I've actually had some people ask, like, can I get one of those certificates of ignorance? So maybe we need to make some, so we can send them to people. Yeah, you get a certificate of ignorance from the Snake Bros Institute. All right, agriculture, ancient agriculture. So, what's so interesting about ancient farmers? You want to have a go at this?
Well, first you gotta build a straw hat, and that's incredibly complex. And then you gotta have boots. And those are even harder to build.
Oh man, yeah, I think boot technology You got to be up to par on your boot technology.
Yeah.
Boot technology.
Snake boots.
Yeah.
You gotta have snake boots. No, it's the idea is that you take some natural growing grass, a type of grass, or it's got some tiny little seeds on it,
Yeah.
and then you sort of genetically modify them by cross breeding them in some way, or whatever they call it,
Yeah.
Until the little seeds on it are
Right, you
getting
cull
bigger.
them somehow?
You cull them and
Yeah.
somehow until they're getting bigger and bigger and more seeds, and you get rid of the one. You stop planting the seeds of the ones that didn't have as many seeds.
Yeah.
And you get more and more seeds, and you keep doing that. For how long? I don't know how long it takes. I don't think anybody really knows how long it takes
No.
to turn a small weed into a corn stalk
Right.
or a small
Turn some kind of like native grass weed into
wheat.
Wheat.
That's just loaded with the seeds on. It's cultivated.
So basically the idea is like the standard model says that they culled it over long periods of time. But long periods of time, we're talking about generations. And I don't mean generations of crops. I mean, people.
Right.
And that's part of the reason why the story is weird, is because when you really think about that, number one, planting a field of crops is not easy.
No.
And then maintaining them is not easy. It's a lot of work. So there needs to be some sort of payback. Well, if you just like plant a field of like native grasses, you can't eat them.
Or they're so low in any proteins and
All right, and then you have to. How are you going to harvest it? Like, the way we harvest the wheat now, you got these big, beautiful, and you can go out there and sort of cut them off, and you've got enough grains mixed in with all the. But if you're doing it with like just grass, it's, So there was a big change that happened with the Ice Age. Okay, number one, sea levels rose 400 feet, and that drowned like tens of millions of square miles of coastal lowlands that now no longer exist and haven't for the past 10,000 years, right? And the coastal lowlands are always the most fertile places. That's where everybody lives, and that's where you do all your planting. That's where all the good dirt is, right? Because it all washes down there from the highlands. The higher you climb, the rockier it gets, right?
yeah.
This is just nature. The peaks of mountains are just rock. There's no dirt. So, suddenly we lost all these coastal lowlands that were the most fertile places on the planet. Now, whether or not there were giant, enormous cities down there that were incredibly advanced, I don't know. I think so. But the point is that that's where all the food was. And it was drowned within, we're talking about, this didn't take thousands of years to happen. Meltwater Pulse 1b, which is the second devastating thing that ended the Ice Age for good,
Do that.
was what geologically is called an isochron. It happens very fast, and we're talking in some cases a matter of weeks here. That it's called Meltwater Pulse 1b, and that means that glaciers that were all over the highlands in North America,
In some cases, miles thick.
suddenly melted and dumped all of their water into the oceans and rose the sea levels hundreds of feet in weeks. Okay? Now, in some places that wouldn't be a big deal because you got cliffs or whatever like that, but there are places where you raise the sea level 10 feet and the water will go inland for tens of miles.
Yeah.
Many, many miles, 10 feet of ocean sea level rise. Just watch any storm surge during a hurricane, or even like some of the tsunamis that have happened. Like a 30-foot tsunami is an enormous problem and a gigantic natural disaster. Imagine hundreds of feet. And that's not including if there were tidal waves from whatever caused the cataclysm, from giant earthquakes and so on and so forth. So you get drowned coastal lowlands, and then after that,
Down or die.
all of a sudden, there's archaeological evidence of this all over the world, people suddenly start playing with agriculture in certain places. Now, in other places, people remain hunter-gatherers or whatever for long
Or
periods. became hunter-gatherers or something. But the point is that around the site of Göbekli Tepe, for example, it's well accepted now that in that same area, native grasses there were suddenly turned into agricultural plants. Now that's a big deal. Like, again, the standard model idea is that people took these grasses and sort of went out and picked the good ones and took the seeds out of those good ones and then planted them somewhere. And then went out into that planting and took the good ones, the big fat or the fattest ones, and then took the seeds out of those and then planted them somewhere the next season. And then went out after they grew and picked the big ones, and you do that over and over and over until you have wheat.
And you also have to imagine if you're picking for seeds to plant, you don't get to eat much
Yeah.
because it takes a lot of seeds to plant a field.
Right.
So what are you eating?
Right.
While you're planning to plant the seeds from the few good plants that you're finding in the field. And then how do you get rid of the already established ones that aren't good? I mean, you have to get rid of them
Yeah.
because their seeds are all in the ground.
Right.
Like today we use things called pre-emergence that will they add an enzyme or something to the soil that will prohibit the seeds from germinating in the season. And then you can plant your special seeds in there.
Right. That are designed to work with that pre-emergence.
It's
But the point is that the story is impossible. Okay? You can't go from picking pears to pushing plows, as George Howard said in one of our podcasts. You know, a really pithy way to put it is that they went from picking pears, in other words, that there was a bountiful place where you could be a hunter-gatherer and it was kind of easy. Like, the end of the Ice Age killed off a ton of species of animals that they just ceased to exist, right? So we can also imagine that it killed off a lot of plant species. You don't have a large animal die-off without also an enormous plant die-off, and there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the biomass on the planet was set on fire in these events, okay? So we can imagine that there was an enormous extinction event in the plant kingdom as well as the mammalian kingdom and,
Right.
you know, the animal kingdom. And who knows how many insects just disappeared and, you know, we look at mammals when we're talking about extinction events. And when you're looking at older stuff, we're looking at birds and lizards. But, like, it's hard to look at, you know, extinction events of very tiny things or even plants. Like, we know in paleontology, they found ferns fossilized ferns that don't exist anymore and so on and so forth. But we have no way of knowing what there was, except that we know that a lot of it died, right, and never came back. So the idea is that it's possible that previous to these cataclysmic events that ended the Ice Age, that these events that completely rewrote the surface of the planet in multiple ways and flooded millions of square miles. I think that it's like the size of the United States and Europe combined, something like that, was completely drowned in water all over the world. Something like that. But the point is that all of a sudden, if previous to that there was just hunter-gatherer cultures and everybody was primitive and they wore nothing but butt flaps, right? All the stuff they were used to was gone. And they had been bottlenecked into a very small population because almost everyone died, humans included. There are many known bottlenecks in human populations, and this is one of them, right? So there's a big bottleneck where previous to that there seems to have been people, and then there's this huge bottleneck where only a few people survived all over the world in tiny little groups. Okay, people survived to then procreate. Basically, probably more people survived the event, but a lot of them died off without procreating because some people survived on their own somehow.
Yeah.
You know,
or you might have entire groups of people that survived that just died out.
Right, because they couldn't find fresh water or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any number of things.
Right. So there's a huge bottleneck in the human population, plus animal populations all over the world that eventually ended up surviving anyway, but then there were enormous amounts of animals and plants that just ceased to exist completely. Okay. So if you think of the idea that before that was this idea of a paradise, of an Eden, of a golden age, where it was kind of easy to live, right? This exists in mythological tales. The idea of Eden is a sort of a widespread thing in mythology all around the world, that there was an ancient golden age. Most of those also talk about the age of the gods and that people were... In one way, you can look at it as like they were spiritually advanced. In other ways, it seems to be like they're talking about technology, and it's not clear which one it is. But the point is that life was easy and then it sucked, right?
Yeah.
But it's at this period, right after these destructions, that suddenly people suddenly become farmers. And that the story that's told that they were developing this agriculture stuff, like, you can't do that. You just can't. You have to have food now. Which means that you can't say, well, let's take these grasses and then my grandchildren will be able to plant wheat. That doesn't work. You've got to eat now, or you won't have any grandchildren, right? So agriculture, in many cases, and then also what's known as domestic species of animals, are anomalous. No one really knows how they came about. There's always a story, like the most common one to talk about with people is dogs. Like, how did we get dogs? Period. The idea is like, well, there's a wolf, and somebody befriended wolves, and eventually you have
they kept the nice pup. The pup was like the most calm.
Right.
Bred that one.
Yeah. There's that meme that I was looking at where it shows the picture of the timber wolf, and it's like looking over there, and it's like, I'm kind of hungry, and I'm going to eat because he's got a fire that's warm, and maybe I can get some scraps. What's the worst thing that can happen? And it's like 10,000 years later, and it shows a pug wearing a birthday hat on his head or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's the standard model story, is that we took a wolf and we've turned him into hundreds of different dog species that are vastly different from each other. But that doesn't really... It's not really clear that that's what happened. That's the assumption, though, that we took wolves or some sort of canine animal species. Maybe there were canines that are completely gone now, that don't exist anymore, that got killed at the end of this thing, and then some people had a pug that they were carrying around. The reason that story is told is because they're like, well, look at animal husbandry. Like, people, nobility in places all over the world for thousands of years were breeding horses into massive, like, awesome running, race horses, or the strongest ones or whatever. And nobility liked to breed dogs too, and they would breed dogs, and they would try to get these traits in them that they liked, and they would breed for the traits, right? But you're like, okay, yeah, but who turned a wolf into a greyhound?
Yeah, I cannot do that.
That's not clear. It's even more not clear as to how we turned aurochs into cattle. That's the story, though, is that aurochs became modern cattle, and they have traced this genetically. Like, okay, we can trace cattle all the way back to a single herd of 80 aurochs. That's the genetic information, the data that exists, right? But who went and got that aurochs and made them into cattle when you're starving, right? It's hard to explain this, but it's sort of just glossed over. Like, well, there were aurochs, and eventually somebody invented beer, and was like, I can get that aurochs, and then they made cattle.
So are you suggesting that it's more likely that all of this happened prior to the destruction
or
of the last ice age?
That all of this stuff is a legacy? In other words, what it more looks like is that what was destroyed at the end of the Ice Age was an advanced civilization, and some of the remnants were people that had technology.
They brought the seeds with them to the mountaintops that were out of the water.
And then, of course, you read all the flood stories and all the myths, including the Bible, and they're told to do this: bring the animals, bring the plants that are good to eat.
Yep.
So on and so forth. Not every freaking plant or every animal on the planet, but all the ones that are good to eat and that are good for the earth and are good for people.
Right.
And like, for those of you who are sort of like, don't tell me about the Bible, well, you can find this in like the story of Manu, which is an Indian story about the same thing, the flood, and some sort of deity says, Manu, there's going to be a gigantic something. You need to get a boat, and you need to put on it like all these animals, and we're going to give you the seeds of these and this and all, carry all the seeds that are good for everything to eat, right? And also, by the way, carry these 7 sages. And the 7 sages represent all the knowledge in the world, that will help people. In other cases, people were told to bury knowledge from their advanced civilization to go get it after the flood was over.
Right. There's the Zoroastrianism.
Right.
Zoroastrianism.
Right.
They were like, dig this massive cave and then put all the seeds and everything down in there and save all the best of everything.
Right.
And then, in the Varas.
The Varas, yes. And they found Varas. There are tons of ancient underground cities all throughout Turkey.
Complexes,
Yeah, complexes, not cities, but complexes that can hold 50,000 people in some cases. So that's a whole other subject. But the point is that, going back to the agriculture, one of the most fascinating things I found out about agriculture, the terracing, okay? So there's, in South America, the Inca Valley, which is basically goes from Lake Titicaca in Peru all the way up to Cusco. Okay, so basically it's just a long valley in the Andes Mountains. And all along that valley, there are ancient cities that have been lived in for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And in those cases, just like we were talking about in the first segment, the bottommost layer of masonry is the most complex and least understood. Okay, attributed to the Inca, but by the standard model, but that's not. There's no evidence for that, right? The Inca, their stonework is a known thing, and it doesn't look anything like the stuff at the bottom of it. At the bottoms of the foundations of these buildings. Anyway, all along this valley, the mountains are terraced. Okay, the terracing is an unbelievably you can't even explain the enormity of the project. To terrace this entire valley of these mountainsides, and in some cases, the terracing goes all the way up and underneath the glacial ice that is on top of the Andes Mountains that exists there now. Okay. Glacial ice that has been there for thousands and thousands of, who knows, probably been there since the end of the ice age that melted everything. So that means that terracing is older than that glacier. Yeah. And it also it seems like the terraces were built from the top down. In other words, that the people who built the terraces started from the tops of the mountains and worked their way down as the water receded.
Yep.
And eventually, ice grew on top of the mountain. Because if you have water way up there, you're not gonna have ice. But as the water receded and they went down the hills to stay close to the water, and they kept building terraces, eventually glacial ice appeared on the tops of the mountains and covered their first terraces. Right? There's some of this in the Americas too. It's not accepted that way, but there are entire hills in the southwest of the Americas and down in New Mexico that have terracing that go all the way to the tops of them. And that's the only hill in an entirely enormously flat plain of desert. Right?
Yeah, so you can imagine it's just ocean.
Right, it's just nothing but ocean, and they live on this tiny little island, and they're building the terraces down as the water goes down.
On top of the terraces, yeah.
Right. So those terraces are...
Stand down or die.
Like, there's a lot of crazy, awesome, amazing stuff in Peru that you can look at. Almost nobody talks about the terracing. But those terraces are probably the most amazing architecturally thing built there. Like, every single terrace has to hold hundreds of thousands of tons of weight of material, and has done that for thousands of years against all elements and zero repairs. No one works on them, at least not in modern day. No one uses them, right? I mean, some of them are used, but you can see ancient terraces all over the place, and they're still there. And they're still holding back all that dirt from falling down.
Yeah.
So they're like little retaining walls, and they have been built to such perfection that they have not failed in thousands of years.
Stand down or
Okay,
die.
and they were built for agricultural purposes in a place where no one would think to farm, right? You look at it and you're like, okay, everything is straight up and down, right? Everything's a freaking cliff. You have a river valley down at the bottom, and a kilometer up is a city on one side, and a kilometer up on the other side of the valley is the quarry that they built that city out of, and in between are all these terraces where they were farming, right? It's like,
It's crazy.
yeah. So the agriculture itself is anomalous because no one really understands, even though the story pretends to understand that these people just sort of, they were hunter-gatherers that eventually became sharecroppers, but it's just not. There's a big gap there. It's the underpants gap, right?
Yeah.
The underpants gnomes, right? You got step 1, steal underpants. Step 2, step 3, take over the world. It's the same problem. Step 1, hunter-gatherer. Step 2, step 3, farmers.
Yeah, so the other major aspect to me of the AAAs, really the other two, architecture and astronomy are connected.
Yes.
when you're looking at it in this context of the end of the last ice age and this destruction, and then you start looking at these massive megalithic structures all over the world in various places separated by oceans that are aligned and pointing to, if you rewind the clock of the changing perspective that we have to the background stars, how they align, it seems to be pinpointing various different time periods, but you can also see it as a way to, because this processional cycle is so long and cyclical, that you can keep track of long-term trends. So if these ancient cultures, why were they so concerned with this long-term trend? And there's a lot of evidence and ancient texts that obviously are talking about these cataclysms and the various different ages that we go through. In India, they have the cycles, the yugas, the cycles of time, and these great destructions, and then rebirth. And there's the whole legend of the phoenix. This idea that we go through this destruction and rebirth over and over and over again, and the idea that we've done this like 6 or 7 times. The ancient Egyptians that spoke to Solon, that he wrote about, or that Plato wrote about, and how they were saying, oh yeah, this has happened like 7 times or whatever.
You Greeks only remember 1 cataclysm. We remember 6.
Yeah. So so you start to look at it in that context, like why were they so obsessed with the motions of the stars, right? It was more than just like you've got the Mayan calendar, which is basically a calendar that its cycle ends at the end of the processional cycle, where they pick the spot, like we pick a spot for the end of the year. You could pick any other day, but we pick a spot that's basically a solstice or right near a solstice.
When you're looking at a circle, if somebody asks you where the beginning is, that part of the beginning is also the end.
Right.
And it could be any spot on the circle, and it's just as correct as any other spot.
Right. So the Mayan calendar has this, same situation. Like the end of the Mayan calendar is basically in a period where, from our perspective, on the vernal equinox, the sun is basically lined up with the center of the galaxy.
Is that thunder?
Something fell outside. I think we've got a crazy windstorm.
Oh, okay.
So there's all over the world, again, these astronomically aligned sites that seem to be pointing to this phenomenon of precession and sort of marking it so that you can see this vast cycle take place, or at least set a point at which the site was built, right? This site was built here. And then there's all these warnings in the mythology surrounding these areas to beware of the end of days.
Yeah.
The destruction is coming. So it's
The end is nigh.
yeah. So it's very suggestive. Like when you look at this whole thing that you've got Göbekli Tepe, as we discussed, it was built right near after the end of this massive cataclysm. And it looks like it might be astronomical. Of course, they put a massive roof over it, so it's very hard to tell.
It's definitely got symbols on it, animal symbols on it that are in many ways associated with astronomy symbols, right? Constellations.
Yes.
So,
And these zodiacal constellations.
Yes.
At that, which are basically the sun passes through them throughout the year, or from our perspective, those constellations seem to move around in a circle behind the sun.
yes.
So over precession, it goes around in a circle behind the sun in reverse, so you can sort of clock this motion. Anyway, you tie all these things together, and it's like the architecture is designed to withstand the force of time.
Right.
The destructive force of time. They are designed in ways that are just mind-blowing. The way they put these things together, they can withstand earthquakes, they can withstand all this crazy devastation. And they're also pinpointing a time in the sky that is relevant to the people who built them. And they come with warnings about the end that's coming again.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like, you can imagine following this whole idea that there was a previous advanced civilization that witnessed this destructive force, and then the remains of that civilization tried to do something about it in terms of the future. Like
Right.
what the people in the future, we need to build something so that they will know and that they can prepare. And it's like it sounds biblical, but this it is. It's like that's to me that is
It's
what
ancient textual.
yeah.
All ancient texts say this in some way or another.
Right.
In many cases, yeah.
Right.
All ancient texts say this like 100% of the time, 70% of the time.
Yeah. So you can imagine if it's like it's a fun thought experiment to imagine what we would do today if something happened. Like we got hit by a meteorite that just wiped out almost everybody, and there were these small groups, pockets of people, and there were some scientists in there, and there were various different people that have different expertise and knowledge about various different fields. You might come together and say, dude, we need to do something, and we got to preserve the knowledge that we had because humanity's going to lose it.
Right.
When we all die off and our children's die off, it's all going to be a legend.
Yeah.
That we were able to, fly in the sky on these great eagles and speak to each other with magical boxes all the way across the world or into the sky.
Yeah.
And there were watchers up there in their secret bunkers in space stations and in secret outer space flying around and like talking to the Oracle and asking all the questions and giving us the answers. It's like so easily imaginable to imagine that this will turn into these crazy legends that later peoples, when they begin to rediscover these things, will start to say, all that stuff's crap. Because the context of what they knew was lost in translation over the eons.
And the technological jargon is lost.
Right.
And then the people are still trying to tell the stories, but they have to couch it in analogies.
Yeah, because their children's children don't have an iPhone and have never seen one and don't
Right.
understand how it could possibly work.
Right, but they might say that we got knowledge from apples.
That's right.
I mean, the concept that the apple of Eden is a technological device from an ancient advanced civilization was like geniusly put into like the video game series Assassin's Creed, right? That the apple was an object that was a technological thing that held knowledge, right? So this concept does exist out there, and it gets into this sort of popular culture in various ways. And I mean, even if you look at the apple on your Apple device, the bite taken out of it is a clue, right? That's the point. It is the apple of knowledge from the tree of knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's why there's a bite taken out of it, because we've all taken the bite.
I heard another idea that it was that Turing, or
Alan Turing,
he actually committed suicide, and he dipped an apple in cyanide and took a bite out of it.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that. That's crazy.
And so that was the impetus for the symbol on the computer. This is Wasn't he basically he was kind of like the inventor of the...
Yeah, of modern computing.
Yeah. I thought that was cool anyway.
That is interesting. I didn't know he committed suicide. I could understand that. I think he was... Well, we won't get into that.
Yeah.
So you're right. So the AAAs that we talk about, the agriculture it's mysterious. It's sort of glossed over. They went from hunter-gatherers to being farmers, and it's just not. That's not clear. The architecture and the other thing that makes the thing that makes it not clear is that it just shows up in the most ancient of cases, and in some cases
That's the context. All of this is like what you said in the first segment, that there were these vast civilizations that just seemed to pop up out of nowhere, full with writing and all this quote unquote mythology,
Yeah.
and then they just vanish
Right. That's right.
all over the world. And then when you start to dig into these structures that they built, they're all astronomically aligned. They're warning us about a destruction. And then, like, if you start to look at the possible timing of these astronomical alignments, and it's pointing
Right. And some people I've seen, okay, so this is one of the questions. Well, like, okay, our civilization, technologically speaking, just sprang up almost out of nowhere, you know, in the big scheme of things. In the last 200 years, we've just bam, right? But, and that's true. But the thing is that our form of writing has been around for a while. Like, let's just for now, let's just go with the English language. You can trace that back for many, many hundreds of years. And see that there people were writing in this with this same sort of alphabetic script.
I mean, the Phoenicians.
Yeah. Well, I'm talking about our alphabet.
Yeah.
And now you go and try to read something in Old English, and it's not easy. Yeah. Okay. It's changed much, but like the writing system existed. Okay. And even at that time, they were building cathedrals. Yeah. Okay, so you can't say that just like the cathedrals are the things that are most likely to survive from our civilization, aside from like hydroelectric dams and stuff like that. But yeah, so if there's a big cataclysm, the thing that's going to survive is stuff we built out of stone.
Right.
And that will be all that survives. The stone thing, like imagine a cathedral with all the stuff it has in it and all the other things. The only thing left will be the stone. All the windows will be gone. All the metal will be gone. Right? Because even if it's not destroyed, eventually people will come and get that metal to make tools.
Yeah.
If they survive whatever destroys everything else. You pull the metal off there because you want to make tools with it, and eventually the metal's all gone and all the other stuff in there is all gone, and all you have are sockets in the stone and just open, So you go at the idea of the Stone Age. The basic idea of the Stone Age, archaeologically speaking, is people who make tools out of stone, like chipped flint stuff. Okay? But it becomes more and more obvious as time goes on that farther and farther back, the Stone Age actually includes megalithic architecture in the sense that people were building enormous things out of stone that still to survive to this day, like the pyramids, like the platforms at Baalbek the Temple Mount, like a lot of the stuff in South America, okay, like a lot of the pyramids in Central America. So you have these gigantic stone constructions, and we look at them today, and they're empty of all possible other things that probably did exist in them and may have, in some cases, been vastly technological. Like the pyramids, it's possible that they were some sort of power plant, because if you look at the interior designs of the Giza pyramids, they make no sense in any way. Like, they just don't make any sense. Like, number one, they don't make sense as tombs at all. Like, Egypt made lots of tombs, and they're beautiful. And they have big, wide hallways with arched ceilings where a whole procession could go in there carrying the sarcophagus of the pharaoh and blah, blah, blah. And then they've got these gigantic rooms down in there but the pyramids don't have that. The entrance of the pyramid is a tiny tunnel that you have to squat in, and it's tilted at like some 35, 45 degrees or whatever.
26.
Yeah. So they look more like the interiors of machines is the point. And this is, so when we were younger, we used to go to some old military bases that had just like giant slabs of concrete in places and there were like weird dips in them and squares and other pockets and stuff, and you can't tell what was in there, but you knew that it was machinery of some kind or other things bolted to the concrete. And that's a lot of these ancient sites have anomalous features that look like that. Now, I'm not necessarily saying there were machines there, but there was definitely something there. That's what those sockets are for. Okay, so we'll get into this after we take the break, but I just want to preface this with saying that, like, a lot of the stuff that's called ceremonial, or that's called tombs, or that's called a temple now, those words are misleading. Maybe not intentionally so, but they are misleading, and we'll get into that after the break.
Stand down or die.
Scratching the surface of every rabbit hole we can think of. Brothers of the Serpent Podcast, returning for the final segment of the final hour. So it's pretty difficult to like we were saying in the beginning, give a 2-hour dissertation on how to enter the rabbit hole. Because it's really just like,
Follow the ancient rabbit. That's how you do it.
there's freaking holes everywhere. So pick one. Another good one is, if you're from the United States, look into giants.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. Anything that sort of does the job of wiping the standard model slate clean. I found this through doing research in physics too. It's like in any of the sciences, when you really start to dig in to what are the scientists actually saying? What are they reporting from their studies? And the good ones will say, we don't know. Like, this is our best guess. But the truth is, we have no idea. Right. And tomorrow, something could be discovered that rewrites the whole.
Right. And it's another thing that I've learned is it's best to bet on that. The history of science is that we have been wrong about almost everything, all the time, right? People think they kind of come up with an idea of what they think is happening, and it's wrong, And like you go back 10 years, there are lots of things that people thought were true then that are no longer considered to be true, and there are things that people thought were not true back then that are now considered to be true. And if you go back 100 years, there's a lot more of those things.
Yeah.
So the trend continues, like the assumption that just because it's current date means that now that trend is almost over and that we pretty much have the whole thing sort of wrapped up and we just got to work
Right.
out the details is silly, because everyone has always thought that.
Right. Just using physics as an example, we were using Newtonian physics for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And everybody was just like, this is it.
Right.
These are all the rules.
Yeah.
But the more the real scientists, the real guys in the weeds, looking at everything, comparing everything, knew there were problems, but there was no theory. And then Einstein comes up with a couple of things and ends up with, general relativity, and that just changes the game. So now it's like, okay, Newtonian physics works for all of this stuff that we can use it.
But the way things really work
is this other way.
This other way.
And then that was going well for a while, and then quantum physics, bam! It's like, people, like that was happening at the same time, but when they really started to make discoveries, beyond the math.
Quantum physics required a lot more technology.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's still happening today. Like I've been listening to, really doing a lot of physics research recently, and I'm hearing stuff that I'm just like, these guys some of these guys are old, and they've been doing this stuff for a long time, and they knew Einstein, they knew, and they are now thinking something is about to happen that's going to rewrite the textbooks. It's like this is still happening. It's always happening. Archaeology happens to be a field where that type of sentiment is not common.
Right.
Now with physicists, it's very common.
Right. It's just not. The thing about physics is that the details are so detailed that most people see physics from far off, and they see a sort of what looks like a complete picture. But as soon as you start zooming in and looking at the details, you find out that there's all these holes in it.
Yeah, the main difference
looks like a flat, straight line from far away.
Right. The main difference is the physicists have mathematicians, and mathematicians are figuring out proofs, and they're like, okay, all of this math works. Now, what's the theory behind how, why, and what is the mechanism?
Yeah.
And that's what everybody's arguing and disagreeing about in physics. But in archaeology, we don't have mathematicians that are giving you things that are true.
Right.
There is none of that. So it's the equivalent to the mathematicians are these structures. They exist, and we know they are true.
Yeah.
Now, the archaeologists come along and try to develop a theory about how it is, and that's all they are.
Right.
Is theories.
Yeah. Archaeology is a social science. It is a quote-unquote soft science. There are hard scientific aspects of it in that, like, you get out there in the field and you sort of grid everything off, and then there's like the
Methods and practices.
methods and practices, yes. But in the end, it is not one of the STEM subjects that is like mathematical and
Yeah.
you know, based in hard science. In other words, it's like it's a lot of guesswork, and it's based on you know, very few and far between evidence. That's the other
Right.
thing. Like, think about your entire house, okay? Let's say your whole house is there and your family has lived in it for your entire life. And then one day, let's just picture your house by itself, okay? And your whole family's lived there, and you've developed it, you've got all this history, all this stuff in there and everything. And then giant lightning bolt hits it, the whole thing gets set on fire, gets burned down flat, and then it all gets covered in mud, and then it stays there for thousands of years, okay? Now somebody shows up way later after the mud is sort of eroded away, and they start digging it out, and they're finding bits and pieces of things. Are they going to be able to build your entire family story? No, they're not going to be. The photographs are all going to be gone. All the documents are going to be completely gone. There's going to be hard things that are left over. Most of the metals will be gone, right? You're going to have certain
couple of gold rings.
Right, there
maybe a
might be some
diamond or
gold
two.
objects, maybe some silver things or whatever. They're going to be heavily corroded if there's any metal left. They're going to have to guess. And they are not going to be able to tell the story of your family. It isn't clear how many of you there were based on the artifacts that are left and how many rooms there are. That's just not clear. I mean, you could have had multiple people in one room, or you had whole rooms that were not used. It's just, the story is almost impossible to tell, right? So with incredibly ancient civilizations, this is the problem. We have, like, the bare remnants, the stuff that lasts for thousands of years left over. And in some cases, another good part of that analogy would have been to imagine that, like, everything happens, the whole house burns down, and then for the next after 1,000 years or so, when the mud erodes away, somebody else comes and builds another house on top of the platform that your house was on, and they live there for a long time, and then that house burns down, and then somebody else comes over there and puts a teepee up and, like, lives in that and has a campfire, you know, and you have, like, thousands of years of occupation. Now, is somebody going to be able to dig through all that stuff and figure out your family's story at the very bottom? When people have been looting the site, taking those golden rings and turning them into things, trading them? No. It's the concrete is all that's left. And it's going to have weird anomalous holes in it where there were pipes and things. And people are, oh, this is a ceremonial well where they were dropped, you know, it's because they found a golden ring down in the bottom of the sewage thing or whatever.
Somebody dropped it down the shower drain. or
Yeah.
whatever.
It's like, we don't know because we don't know. That's the thing. And when there's no textual, the quote-unquote recorded history, which begins with the Sumerians when people started writing stuff down. Well, according to the model that we have now, it begins with the Sumerians when people were writing things. Sumerians invented writing,
They hunt travelers.
according to the standard model.
Recruit them.
But
I'm not sure.
there are anomalous artifacts that have
This is
script
something
on
new.
them that have been found all over the
And I've
world.
nearly
So
forgotten
again,
what new... I need to retrace my steps.
what happens is people, because
And
it's a
take this
social
crest.
science and people are trying to
You
put
will
together a
remain hidden
coherent
from the
story,
harbingers until you
and this
activate
coherent
it.
story has been
Once
around
you're
for
a
hundreds of
traveler,
years.
You'll need
in
to
Western
find them
academia,
in empowered timelines. I hope to see you back
It's
here
difficult to
soon.
change it, you know,
Alive.
because when you go all the way back to the beginning of their coherent story, if you change one tiny little thing there, like the age of the Sphinx, for example, it changes everything. The entire story has to be thrown out. So,
Yeah, and that's another great rabbit hole that you know you finally get a quote unquote hard scientist or a hard science guy,
yeah.
Robert Schoch, who comes and looks at the Sphinx because it's actually dug out of the bedrock. He's not really looking at the Sphinx. He's looking at the part that was never restored, which is the wall, the enclosure where they cut the stones out going down, and he's seeing water erosion. Just like all the other water erosion that he's been studying as a geologist for years. And, you know, he looks back through, you know, the standard model of geology and what we've understood from ice cores and whatever about the different types of weather patterns that are happening. And he comes up with, in his estimation, a very conservative date of roughly around 12,000 years.
Yeah.
Is how long that's enclosure has been exposed. conservative date for him. Like
Meaning that's the most recent
recent one.
Yeah. It could be thousands, many thousands of years older than
Right, and that was just, completely ridiculed. And then they find Göbekli Tepe. Right? Nobody could build anything like this out of stone at that time.
Yeah.
You're a kook. And then they find Göbekli Tepe, which was built at that time and is the skill involved is comparable.
Right.
So
No one talks about that.
right. It's
Sphinx is still 3,000 years old.
yeah, but it's
Or
awesome.
5,000 years old,
It's
sorry.
awesome.
Yeah.
So to me, the thing that excites me the most, and I'm sure I have a confirmation bias about it, but whatever, is the idea that this most recent cataclysm, the end of the last ice age, roughly 13,000 years ago, that there was some high civilization, however you define it, a civilization capable that had the knowledge of the 3 A's: agriculture, astronomy, and architecture, and possibly many other things, lived and existed in areas of the world that are now covered in oceans, or that were completely wiped out in the cataclysm, and the remnants of that civilization moved on and tried to preserve their knowledge. And this is where...
And in some cases tried to pass it on to other peoples they found.
This is where these legacies come from. This is where the mythology comes from. When you start to look at all the different mythologies all over the world, they have this character that is very similar to each other. A lot of the stories are the same. A lot of the buildings look the same. A lot of the architecture looks the same. And I just think that's fascinating. And so the pursuit for me is finding more of these connections. So reading the ancient texts, looking and observing photographs, images of the ancient sites, reading people's scientists' accounts of what they found, and comparing all of this stuff and trying to find these connections.
Yeah.
It's just...
All right, so let's
awesome.
let's go through some questions here. First one, are we talking about Atlantis?
I would say yes.
Yeah, because Atlantis has become a catch-all word for an ancient and advanced civilization that was destroyed in a global cataclysm of some kind.
Right.
If you just take it at its base, just the most base value of it, Plato gave a lot of details, okay, telling you how big the city was and all this kind of stuff, but the basic idea of that story is that there was an ancient advanced civilization that was very advanced and were globe-trotting. In other words, they went all over the world.
That existed 9,000 years before the time of Solon.
Right. Which puts them right up to the end of the last ice age.
Or they were destroyed at that time.
Right, exactly. They existed right up to the end of the ice age and wham.
And to me, I don't interpret that as a single city. I mean, he did talk about a single city, and that's,
that was the central city. That
Right.
was the capital, basically.
Right. When you look at, a lot of the people, Atlantis seekers, they're all looking for one place.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Place.
That's fine, but I think that it's just more evidence of the existence of... I don't think it's a single place. I think they were global.
Yeah, of course.
The knowledge...
Plato says that they were global.
Yeah.
They fought a war with the Roman civilization, right? And possibly the Osirian one, which was in the area of Egypt.
Yeah.
And they fought a war with another advanced civilization, and in his story, he says that they got so arrogant in their power that something destroyed them. Now, what that means, I don't know, but the point is that in his story, he indicates that there were other advanced civilizations that were able to fight and hold their own in a war with Atlantis, right? So we have to assume that there were multiple advanced civilizations, or we have to assume that that's what he meant. That's what the story tells us. And of course, the Egyptian guy who was talking to Solon was also saying that, like the Osirian civilization, that they're, according to them, civilization stemmed from. Now, this is the other thing. So the Atlantis question brings me to another thing that is a very fascinating rabbit hole to go down that outlines this whole thing, and that is that in some cases there are textual references that archaeologists use today to sort of replace things like kings. They're called king lists. Sumer had them. Egypt had them. There's other ones. I can't remember what they are right now. But the point is that there are these lists that ain't very, very ancient, like dawn of time or dawn of written word civilization time had these lists, and they, according to their own lists, extend their civilizations back many tens of thousands of years than we do, right? The Egyptian king list goes back hundreds of thousands of years. There are some kings in it that apparently reigned for impossible periods of time, tens of thousands of years. The Sumerian king list is the same thing. Somewhat similar to the biblical patriarchs in the Old Testament that lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And Methuselah being the most famous, that lived for almost 1,000 years, 900 and something. Noah supposedly lived for 600 and something years, right? So you have many ancient myths that talk about way back in the past. In the very distant ancient past, people had incredibly long lifespans, and these lifespans slowly grew shorter over time according to their lists. Now, what's fascinating is that when you look at the archaeological story, they totally go by the king lists, especially in Egypt, to tell us what king built what temple or when they existed, because they're going by the king lists, right? They're written in stone. So they're like, okay, so this guy existed at this point, his reign lasted for this long, and he built this pyramid and that temple. But they totally ignore the beginning parts of the king list that have all of these very long-lived, very much more ancient kings that extend the civilization back hundreds of thousands of more years. So in other words, they have this whole list, and they're like, well, this part of it we believe because it fits our prejudices, but this part is bullshit.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's like, I always complain about people using courtroom references when they're talking about science, but in this case, it's an apt analogy. You can't bring in something into a courtroom and present it as evidence and say, but ignore this part of the evidence, just look at this part, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't work, right? You can't do that. And that doesn't work in science either. You can't say, well, just this part is okay, this part's bullshit, right? No, you have to look at all the evidence. And if you're going to say that you accept this part, then you have to explain why you don't accept this part. And their explanation is, it's obviously mythological.
Yeah.
Obvious to what? Because you don't believe it, right? You believe this part and not that part.
Yeah.
And these lists were official, right? So the explanation there is like, well, they had this mythological beginning of their civilization. Everybody does that, right? All these ancient civilizations have these. They like to pretend that they came from these like auspicious beginnings with these gods.
It's kind of the mammoth in the room, right? They all have these mythological beginnings.
Right. Oh, they all do it.
That
Really?
scientists don't accept, right? Right, we did that.
I cannot do that.
We created an entire mythology about how we all came from Europe
Yeah.
and other
Totally
places in the world.
fabricated.
Yeah, we just made it all up. There was a king, and he sent us all over here.
Yeah.
It's totally fake.
Right. It's a completely fake story. So, the king lists are, to me, a large chunk of evidence that I was fascinated with for a long time, still am, and they're not explained. And and really, when you look at the spans of time, they're mathematical in some ways. They have all these various strange mathematical things in them.
Processional numbers, yeah.
Right, processional
Astronomical numbers.
Astronomical numbers. And that may or may not mean that there's something more going on there than just giving a list of kings. But it isn't clear why they suddenly started giving a list of kings that had quote-unquote believable lifespans, and then they had lists that were unbelievable. And of course, the archaeologists will say, well, the dividing line is where it became myth, right? And you're like, well, why was that dividing line there in the first place? And why do you, my question is always like, why do you follow this part of it as though it's gospel and get mad at anybody who thinks something differently? But the rest of it is all myth, and get mad. You get mad if anybody believes that part.
My brilliance is unequaled.
I mean, why don't you at least, try to understand why this might be happening? And okay, to give some people credit that some people have, there have been plenty of people who have looked at the King's List and tried to understand the lists in terms of math and said
Symbolism and all
like
that
symbolism or whatever, and you know, and said like maybe these kings did. But even if you did a whole bunch of math and like got the reign times of these kings down to quote unquote believable lengths, you still have a civilization that is far older than you initially thought it was, and that the standard model says it is now. So. I love the king's subject.
Yeah.
So a lot of ancient civilizations have these quote-unquote myths that put their beginnings as going, or not even. So a lot of the South American civilizations, they're not even talking about their own beginnings. They talk about much more ancient previous civilizations that were not them. Right. And in some cases, what's even more fascinating there are some sites, and this is. The ones I know the most about are in the Americas, but there are also ones elsewhere in the quote-unquote old world where there are no legends about them. No one, including the locals, have any idea where they came from or how they got there. Yeah. Those are also fascinating, you know? Like, for example, there's a site in South America, in Peru, on the border of Peru and Bolivia, where when the Spaniards that were there, you know, first showing up or whatever, they asked the local natives, like, and it was this giant, it's all these megalithic blocks all over the place.
Yeah, Pumapunku.
Yeah. The Spaniards asked the locals, like, well, did you guys build that? And they're like, no. That was the gods, is what their answer was, basically. But it's basically more like, we don't know. It was obviously the gods, because look at it, right?
Yeah.
That was basically the answer. So, man-made all is kind of like that. There's a place in the Pacific, in Oceania, on an island called Pompeii, I think, or it's not like Pompeii in ancient Greece, but it sounds like that. The island is called that. But the place is like completely anomalous, built out of unbelievable megalithic stones, and there are millions of tons of it, and there aren't any. No one knows who built it. The natives that live on the island are terrified of that entire side of the island. They won't even go over there.
Yeah.
But if you look at the archaeological story, it's like 1,500 years old.
Yeah.
And they attribute it to the people who were last there, that lived in some of the remnants of the structures that were building fires in there. They're like, well, yeah, there's old fires here, and we date it to being, 1,500 years ago. I'm like, okay, that's like going back to the analogy of the house. You attribute the entire house structure to the last people who built a campfire on top of the platform.
Yeah.
So that happens with a lot of ancient cultures.
That's another thing, like the Moai on Easter Island, for
Right.
example. Like they attribute all that to 1,500 years ago or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Right. That the Easter Island statues were all cut and put into place within 100 years of when the Europeans showed up.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating, and I found this out by, I was digging through some museum had a sort of a catalog of images of Easter Island stuff, and then some of them were these sketches, very detailed, beautiful pencil sketches done by some of the first explorers to show up at Easter Island, right? So they were sitting there in some place and they're drawing the statues, and it's all very precise and very clean. And you can look at a picture, a modern day picture of that same place where that person was sitting and compare them, and nothing has changed.
Right.
They're almost exactly identical. In other words, the statues are buried up to their chins, they're tilted over, and so if that's true, and that European who showed up there and sketched that less than 100 years after those statues were put in place, you have to believe that all of the burying of the statues, which is in some cases 30 feet or more of material, happened within 100 years of them being put up and then stopped.
Yeah. No evidence for that whatsoever.
Right. And that would be cataclysmic. In other words, it would have knocked the statues over, but they're all leaning as though all that material has been slowly moving down the mountain and sort of burying them very slowly and tilting them very slowly over time until they have these cool tilted aspects to them, right? So, but it's crazy. You look at these very old European drawings and then the picture of it in the modern day, and they're like, they look exactly the same.
And there's a platform there that the stonework on the platform is identical in nature to
Not do that.
Stuff in Peru.
stuff in Peru
Yeah,
and
in ancient Greece.
the really old stuff like down in the Osirian or whatever in
Yeah.
Egypt. It's just like,
And that platform, one of the stones, is a piece of a statue.
yeah,
Remember that?
yeah.
You can see that they reused something there. It's
I
like
cannot do
so.
that.
In a lot of cases,
And there's writing there that was found that looks nearly identical to another form of writing that was found in Turkey or something like that.
the Mohenjo-daro stuff
Okay, yeah, the Rongo Rongo writing from
Easter Island
Easter
looks exactly like the Mohenjo-daro script, which is
And neither one's ever been translated. They
right.
don't know.
Mohenjo-daro is like East India-Pakistan border. Yeah.
It's just everything we know is wrong. That's basically the deal.
In a lot of cases,
That's why we give out certificates of,
That's right.
ignorance.
Certificates of ignorance, because everything we know is wrong. And until you admit that we're wrong about everything, you can't start trying to figure out what's right. There's also plenty of other anomalous stuff all over the world, like just to name a few, like that I love. Cart ruts. You know, ruts in stone that look like they were made by wheeled vehicles when the stone was soft. And there's examples of this in the Americas, in the Mediterranean areas. There are a ton of them on Malta. They're in Turkey. They're probably elsewhere. I'm sure there's some in Egypt, but most of them are probably under the sand.
One of my favorite things is the legends of magic and how they are everywhere you look to find anything on these old ancient legends of magic. It's all astronomical.
Yeah.
It's all connected to
Right. You draw big circles with diagrams and then they look a lot like constellations.
Yeah, but the times and dates that you have to do things and
Yeah.
under the specific positions of the planets and the way that connects to this weird idea of astrology and how the positions of planets and stars and all this kind of stuff is going to tell you your fate.
Right.
And then you compare that to the idea of this cataclysm and that there are these cycles of destruction and rebirth
Right.
of the Earth. And it's cool. That's one of my favorite things to do.
That is true, yeah. The whole astrology is a misunderstood ancient science that is now called astronomy. And if you do know cycles of astronomy, it does tell you the fate of things.
That's right.
You can tell the future because everything in space goes around in circles in some way or another. It's like alchemy. Alchemy became chemistry. Right? It's like the study of ancient alchemy that was revived in Europe by the translation of the Hermetica from ancient Egypt. Well, originated, as far as we know, with ancient Egypt, was translated into Greek, and then ended up in Byzantine Rome, and that book was eventually brought to Europe and translated, and then it caused the Renaissance,
Yeah.
practically caused the Renaissance, right? It began the scientific technological age that we know of now.
Yeah. And the idea that
From
there are-
ancient Egypt.
Yeah. And the idea that there are these vast cosmic weather patterns. Like, we are studying weather on the Earth right now, and we know that there are these jet streams of air that have these patterns that are going to push cold air, and then the Earth is going to move around the sun, and the position of the poles tilt in reference to the sun is going to change seasons, and the currents of air are going to swirl over here, and the ocean currents, the Pacific decadal oscillation changes every 10 years going one way and then flips to the other. It's a 20-year cycle that changes the weather. We have El Nino and La Nina, these different
Storm patterns, yeah.
jet stream patterns so there are these long cycles, quote unquote long cycles of weather on the Earth. There is a long cycle of weather in the cosmos. We have, similar to the jet streams, meteor streams that have been there for thousands and thousands of years, and our position as we move around and everything is shifting in these cyclical motions over long periods of time. Sometimes we get the rains coming from that jet stream,
That's right.
And those cause cataclysms. So you look at this processional cycle, this long way of sort of clocking the cosmic weather patterns that affect the Earth. And you can see as you go back in time, like, bam, destruction, bam, fertilization, rebirth.
I cannot do
Yeah.
that.
Another destruction, fertilization, rebirth, and so on.
Exactly.
It's
And that's why at the beginning of every podcast we have Space Weather News.
very important.
Space Weather News is incredibly important.
We have a variable star.
That's right. And we have a variable universe. Like, the standard model tells us that the universe itself has evolved, right? The story of the Big Bang. You start out with nothing, and then bam, and then ever since then, the universe has been changing drastically over short and long periods of time, and things have been developing and evolving and changing and developing, and you have patterns and cycles, and everything in space is going around or whirlpooling or spinning or orbiting or something in circles. And so when you see these ancient sites with spirals all over them, you know,
Yeah.
and then there are these long, sinuous, snake-looking
Yes.
forms that are built into the ground that like just happen to like predict freaking lunar eclipses.
Yeah. And then it's like looking at all of that stuff, then you start to ask yourself, what would we do, you know, if we experienced some cataclysm? And that's
What would Snake Bros do?
no,
Awesome Possum
our
Face.
civilization.
Oh, okay.
Awesome Possum Face, that's right. Strike a pose. Try to become an out of place artifact.
That's right.
No, but as a civilization, what would we do? We would try to preserve these
#Part challenge.
these fundamental understandings of the universe. Like, hey, we're actually going around. That sun is what's giving us the energy of life all the time. So you can see we're trying to preserve this knowledge, and then eventually people, what we call quant sup it, they lose the context and they start worshiping the sun, quote unquote worship.
Right.
Right. And we're trying to tell them that is where the energy is coming from.
Right. Exactly. Well, I think we've done the best we could on the broad brush, not diving into the rabbit holes too far, but showing you where all the rabbit holes are idea.
And thanks for the suggestion. That was a good suggestion. We need to do this.
Yes.
At least give it a shot.
It was a fantastic suggestion. And I totally enjoyed doing this show. That was a lot of fun. We haven't done something like this since the beginning, so.
We'll do it again on episode 164.
Yeah. All right, you guys can get a hold of us at brothersoftheserpent@gmail.com.
You can visit the website at brothersoftheserpent.com. You comment there. Check out the encyclopedia and the glossary.
That's right. And follow us on Twitter. I'm having all kinds of awesome Twitter conversations with people, and I'm posting pics there. And the Twitter handle is @SnakeBros with no vowels, SNKBRS.
And share the shows.
That's right. And don't forget to donate to our pyramid scheme, which sends us straight to pyramids. You can find the donate button on the upper right part of the website on the front page.
Yeah. And thank you, everyone who has donated.
Yes, thank
We
you
are
guys
getting
so
more
much.
donations, and it's totally awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, and
Yeah.
you, and you, and you, and you.
And also, I want to tell you guys again, this dude, History Shift, Brandon Ricks, has become even more awesome since the last time I told you about him. You can follow him at History Shift on Twitter. He always posts lots of cool stuff there. He has a YouTube channel. You can find him at History Shift. Just look up History Shift on YouTube. You can find him there. He has been making the Snake Bros podcasts into videos to post on the internet, and he's already sent me like 8 or 9 of them. I'm redoing.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he's so awesome, dude. I just want to tell you, Brandon, History Shift, dude, you're awesome. And the
you.
conversations we're having that are ongoing are also awesome. So you're a badass, bro. Thank you so much. You are a godsend. And I think that's it. Thank you guys so much. We also love all of you listeners. You are also totally awesome. Good night, Adamu. Get back to work.
cannot do that. Stand down and die. Mana courses through me! I must break free.
The Weaver waits.
Yeah!